Have you ever asked yourself the question, how should we judge the Bible? How should we treat it critically and historically? Are the stories and themes it contains possibly written for a different time and a different way of understanding the world? Or is it still relevant to us today? If you were like me, and maybe you're not, I watch a lot of debates on the topics of philosophy, theology, and let's say historicity of the New Testament. Now, if this is not your favorite pastime, let me summarize what typically happens. One side presents a compelling argument, and then the other responds. But it's not through the lens of what was just put forth, but rather through a completely different lens with a completely different set of presuppositions. You might say, well, that's what debate is, right? Not exactly. It's what debate has become, and I think that is due to many things, actually. The first being that Christian belief, or say theism in general, is based on a pre-modern, pre-Enlightenment philosophy. That is, its foundation is metaphysical. Truth, knowledge, and value are derived from something outside ourselves. Now, whether it's obvious to a modern-day believer or not, Orthodox Christianity holds this concept as central to its belief structure, and any attempt to find truth or value from a source other than God causes problems. Christians may not see themselves as philosophers, but in fact they are, and they primarily face adverse worldviews from two or maybe three camps. Enlightenment thinking, founded in reason, I think therefore I am, and postmodern thinking, which rejects the idea that we can know anything with certainty, and that any claim of objective knowledge is an attempt at asserting or maintaining political or economic power. As a Gen Xer myself, that all sounds very familiar. Now, while Christians may find much in common with Enlightenment thinkers, given that reason and science only affirms belief in God, many find fundamental disagreements with postmodernists. Now, it is debated as to whether or not postmodernism has run its course, but many look around and conclude that, in fact, it is alive and well. No matter where you stand, I think we have to recognize that we are all influenced by postmodern thinking, both in our relationship to truth, our views on authority, and the high value we place on individual experience and perspective. So it begs the question, in light of postmodern thinking, can the Bible still be true? Was it ever true? To answer that question, I want to first ask another question. When we view the Bible through a postmodern lens, are we being fair to the text, to the stories it contains, and to God's originally intended purpose? Now, in order to ask this question, we have to presuppose a biblical worldview, because Christianity begins with the assumption that God has directly revealed himself to man, and in the process given us a framework to comprehend objective truth. And I believe he has done this through a process called progressive revelation. Throughout history, God has communicated with humanity and revealed himself and his will through the scriptures with increasing clarity. God accommodates to our understanding. For example, if Jesus had not been prophesied to come when he did, and rather had been born in, let's say, 1990, I think God's plan for salvation would look different. Crucifixion doesn't exist today. The sacrificial system doesn't exist either. God would contextualize this monumental event for us in this era. So to look at how God chose to implement his plan of salvation for humanity in 1st century AD and then judge it through a modern philosophical lens is simply not fair. But more on this later. A critique I often hear about Christian origins in the New Testament itself is the argument that the stories of Jesus mirror many stories of other historical figures and are therefore invented. Alexander the Great was said to be virgin-born more than 300 years before Jesus. The same was said of Augustus Caesar. In fact, Julius Caesar, Plato, Pythagoras, Buddha, Socrates, and many more were said to have been born of a virgin through divine intervention, and were called the Son of God. The same can be said for Jesus' ascension, post-mortem appearances, and miracles. Now, for many people, this is a significant issue. In this video, I'm not even going to broach the subject of how the New Testament is wholly different from these contemporary stories. Just know that every one of these correlations can be explained away logically and historically when we look at them one by one. What I would like to propose is this simple idea. If God was going to make himself known, he would do it through a medium that the audience would understand. Again, progressive revelation. God accommodating to our understanding. So, if God is actually going to do something big in history, I think it follows logically that he would leverage the most relevant and powerful themes from culture as proof. C.S. Lewis touches on this idea in his essay Myth Became Fact, written 13 years after his famous conversation with Tolkien. in which Tolkien convinced Lewis that Christianity was indeed the true myth. Here's what Lewis says. We must not be ashamed of the mystical radiance resting on our theology. We must not be nervous about parallels in pagan Christ. They ought to be there. It would be a stumbling block if they weren't. We must not, in false spirituality, withhold our imaginative welcome. Those who do not know that this great myth became fact when the Virgin conceived are indeed to be pitied. I just love this approach to the mythical nature of the New Testament stories. While I do personally affirm and uphold New Testament historicity, I think we can often overlook the mythical power of the stories and God's specific intention of merging the miraculous with the mundane. While not a myth, but rather a scholarly attested historical event, Jesus' crucifixion could itself also be seen as a sign of the times, a statement by God made inside the Jewish sacrificial system through the vehicle of Roman oppression. The crucifixion was quite possibly the only way for God to accomplish his plan of redemption for humanity through Jesus, and subsequently launch his church against all odds. The mere survival of the church out of the first century should stand as enough evidence on its own. Nevertheless, critics of Orthodox Christianity push back on a God-ordained view of the crucifixion, calling it divine child abuse. Yet it is the crucifixion itself that completes the story that God began centuries prior, a story of God doing what only he can do, a story that time and time again shows the creator of the universe accommodating to our understanding, and rather than making his ultimate power and authority known, he chooses to make a habit of partnering with the weak, the insignificant, and the powerless. I often hear skeptics say if God was real, he would make himself known. It would be more obvious that he existed. But what I feel skeptics miss is the beauty in the story that God has weaved since the beginning of time. The Bible is a beautiful story of God's providence. It's the story of a slowly developing miracle working its way through human history. It's a story that serves as a testimony to God's faithfulness. We see it in Noah, God resetting life on earth through one family. In Abraham, God creating a chosen nation through a single elderly couple. In Joseph, a story of God's faithfulness and redemption. In Moses, an abandoned baby turned God's chosen leader in spite of his shortcomings. In David, the smallest and most rejected becoming a king after God's own heart. In Jesus, God coming to earth as a marginalized Galilean peasant baby. And finally, in the church, born of persecution, fragile, and yet so resilient that it revolutionized Roman culture and transformed Western civilization forever. This is how God works. It's slow, it's miraculous, and yet it has gaps, because gaps require faith. And if I'm being honest, I think that's the point. Faith is what God desires. We will never have enough evidence to fully convince the postmodern mind, because in fact, the Christian worldview is built on a completely different philosophical structure, one that believes deeply in objective truth, moral value, and the idea that God entered into human history in the person of Jesus to embody both. So if you find yourself doubting the Christian story, just remember that God works in slow and mysterious ways, because faith is his goal and a changed heart is his purpose. Hey, you made it to the end of the video, and we're really proud of you. And now that you're here, take some time and click like and subscribe. And then go over to thelandinthebible.com if you want to help us to create more content, because your support there goes a long way.